incest with his older daughter, you're the offspring, and you're the offspring of the offspring of the offspring of the offspring. So can you imagine how much you hate the ancestry of the man that began this whole thing? And that's where the Moabites were in what they thought of the Israelites. It led to a people group that were not very of their own heritage, and their own heritage originated in the Abrahamic family. So it was so bad that at one point the Moabite women were directed to seduce the Israelite men into sexual. It became part of the story of Israel, part of God's commands to Israel. Now remember, it doesn't go wasted. The Moabite women were ordered to seduce the Israelite men in order to mess up the lineage, in order to mess up the promise, in order to mess up the line, you know? But it didn't mess it up. It just made it come out that much clearer. That's what we're going to see as we walk through this. But don't forget the fact as we go into the next couple of weeks. And then on to the Moabite people hiring Balaam to curse Israel. I mean, it was just not good blood here in any number of different ways. We saw last week that because of a famine, Elimelech leads his wife Naomi and their two sons to the land of the Moabites. And you would think that that's a pretty stupid thing to do, to take your family and lead them into a land of people that don't like you very much. The only problem is there's a history of the patriarchs in times of famine, leaving the promised land, going into other lands, and then coming back enriched. And it had become story after story, handed down from generation to generation. So it was with confidence that they left out. And they get there, they're there, I don't know how long, it wasn't very long. It was as long as it took to get to verse 3. And in chapter 1, they're not there very long, and Elimelech, the patriarch that had packed up his family and left out with them, he dies. And he leaves Naomi there with her two sons, who then marry Moabite women. And then 10 years later, the two sons die. And so now you have Naomi, the widow of Elimelech, and two Moabite daughter-in-laws. And things are just not working out right. But they hear that the harvest has come back to Bethlehem. Bethlehem, the house of bread, in the promised land. They hear that it's coming back. Naomi hears that it's coming back, but her mindset is, I have nothing to go back to, because she had no sons left. And the land was given to the different tribes of Israel, and they didn't have ownership of it like the way we would think of ownership. And it's something for us to look at and remember as we go through this. But they didn't have ownership of it. They had ownership of it. But the truth of it is, it was in recognition that God owned everything. And he told them they couldn't sell it. You could rent it for a while. You know, you could abandon it, but you can't sell it. It could only be passed down. And the fact is that Naomi had nobody to pass her land. She was a dead end with no hope. But yet there was all these pictures of promises that the stories of the Israelite patriarchs implied. If you leave Israel and you sojourn into a foreign land, things are going to work out even better for you, because your God likes you, and he's going to take care of you, and he's going to enrich you. And it's happened here, and it happened here, and it happened here, and it happened here. But it didn't happen with Elimelech. He died. And guess what? God never promised all of this. But Naomi, and as we look into it, you can sense that Naomi was very disappointed in God. In fact, she said that he's turned his hand against me. And she made that judgment that God had turned his hand against her based on stories and on what she had invented in her mind. It had nothing to do with God's promise. And we saw last week, don't we all do that? We get out here in our imagination and we apply things to God, and we say, well, he promised he would bless this, and he promised he would bless this, and he's going to enrich me if I do this, and he's going to do that. And then we get out there and something doesn't happen. It's like a pyramid scheme or multi-level thing. You hear 2 or 3 people happen it, and you know that I'm going to make it big. Maybe you will. But I'm just saying, if you're disappointed, it's not because you had a promise that came from God. And Naomi thought she had a promise that came from God, and it was so ingrained in her thought pattern and her culture that she became a woman. So now she's faced with going back, because here's the harvest. They're starting to get on really hard times because there's no man in a man-centered culture, and they're starting to get on really hard times. And so Naomi says, I'm going to go back, the failure that I am, I'm going to go back, the example of God's hand being turned against someone, that's who I am. And I'm going to go back into Bethlehem, and I'm just going to live off the scraps. And then she turns to her 2 daughter-in-laws and she said, you need to go back to your people. You need to head back to your people. And one of the daughter-in-laws said, weeping, it wasn't because she wanted to. There's no hint of her doing something wrong. In fact, she did what Naomi told her to. She goes back to her people. But Ruth, the other daughter-in-law, the other Moabite daughter-in-law, says, I'm not going back. I'm coming with you. She worded it like this in verse 16 of chapter 1. But Ruth said, do not urge me to leave you or turn back from following you. For where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I'll be buried. Thus may the Lord do to me, and worse, if anything but death parts you and me. And when Naomi saw that Ruth was determined to go with her, she didn't say anything else. Now, I just want to get out and think a little bit. Why would Ruth want to go with Naomi? Naomi was a bitter woman by this time. She wasn't happy. She wasn't going home whistling worship songs on the trail going back. She was not happy. She was bitter. And she was saying, it's better for you to go back to your people. Go back to your gods. Go back to where you're coming from. Go back to them, because this one didn't work out real well for me. But yet, there's something inside of 10 years with Naomi, with her sons. There's something inside of this 10-year relationship to where Ruth had gotten hold of a hope. And she knew that where she came from, she couldn't go back. And she had experienced God's kindness through Naomi, this bitter old woman. And what I'm saying to you is that God's going to reveal his kindness oftentimes through you in spite of your attitude. What you're thinking this week, as far as God's concerned, it has nothing to do with him displaying his kindness. And that's just so weird. I mean, I think God's effectiveness is dependent on what kind of mood I'm in this week, or what I believe this week. Because it all started with my belief anyway, right? So it's all dependent on me, right? Here's a bitter old woman, and here's Ruth saying, I got to go where you go. And Naomi's going, are you crazy? What are you thinking? I'm a bitter old woman. But the beauty of it is that God was now displaying his kindness through Ruth back to Naomi, because Ruth could look right past all of this bitterness and see into Naomi's heart. That's where we were in chapter 1. They left out, headed back to Bethlehem, to the harvest. Ruth had been confronted by the kindness or the relationship that was there in Naomi, somebody who probably didn't regard her by the way her own people regarded her. And even though Naomi had lost hope, Ruth had found it inside the relationship. But the storyline's about to take a turn. And it's where the Lord, and this is where I want to come across this morning. The Lord declares that he meets us in the midst of tragedy. And when he meets us there, he sets the stage to display his faithfulness. So we're in the middle of our moods, right? I got my moods. I mean, I was up at 4:30 this morning. I'll pretty much guarantee you I'll have a mood about 4:30 this afternoon, especially if I don't get a nap. And usually, even if I do get a nap, I'll end up waking up more pissy than I did before I had the nap. Because we know naps are supposed to fix everything, right? And so we think that the world revolves around my mood and what I'm thinking and where my head's at and all that kind of stuff. I'm telling you that you don't have to sweat it. God's doing his deal, no matter what you feel like. And that's just, in some ways, it's insane. You see, the interesting thing is in the midst of this horrible story, Elimelech died, the two sons died, one daughter-in-law goes back. Naomi says, I'm going with you no matter what. The stage is set perfectly for God to demonstrate his faithfulness. Because in this whole thing is his lineage of hope. In this whole thing is the beginning of displaying this line that would lead to Jesus. Look at verse 1 of chapter 2. Now Naomi had a kinsman of her husband, a man of great, translated a different way, a mighty warrior, of the family of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. So Boaz is a man who has won his reputation as a mighty warrior and a mighty man. He has all the riches and the finances, but it comes because he comes from a lineage, and not only a lineage of power and of goodness, not only that lineage of that, but he had proven himself out of his own right. Boaz was a powerful man. Boaz grew up with Nahshon, his grandfather. And we're talking about the time of Judges, so wars were still going on even at this time. In Numbers chapter 1, God ordered Moses to take a census of all the men of war, 20 years old and above, to see who was available for war. They numbered these men by the tribes in Israel. And when the tribe of Judah was numbered, it was the largest, having 74,000 men. Nahshon was the chief of Judah, and he was put over the warriors. Nahshon was the first guy to bring a tribute offering to the new tabernacle. Nahshon was the guy who led the tribe of Judah, who led the Hebrew people to the promised land. There's a Hebrew tradition that said when the Red Sea was parted, that the first person to take a step into it was Nahshon of the tribe of Judah. I mean, this was a big name. His son, Salmon, at least that's the way it's spelled, just like Richard Salmon, he brings from Alaska. Salmon marries Rahab, who was the prostitute of Jericho, who took the Israelites' side and made it possible for them to take Jericho. So Salmon, son of Nahshon, marries Rahab, and they have a son, and his son's called Boaz. You see the lineage coming back? So Boaz grows up with this heritage, but yet he also proves his own self on the battlefield. In fact, he was such a name, Boaz was such a man that when Solomon built his temple, there were two columns out in front, and one of the columns was named Boaz. That's the man we're talking about this morning. That's who God ordered to be in the lineage of Christ. But not only that, that's who God ordained to be the bearer of his kindness to two destitute women. Just think about that for just a second. The most powerful man from a lineage of the most powerful tribe, that has the most storied past, that's full of all the honor. He is the man that the Lord ordains to put in the pathway of a Moabite woman. How's that possible? Tell me what it says to you. You're all staring at me. What does it say to you that God would take the most preeminent man in their culture of this town and put him in a direct path of intersection with a Moabite woman who's coming up behind a bitter old woman, and he puts Boaz right in the we don't know. We're not going to know what happens till next week, but actually we're going to see part of it this week. What's it say to you? Yeah. And he's done the same thing for you. Now you may be, in quotes, a bitter old woman right now. You might be a place where you think that you have been ordained by God to have his hand turned against you. That might be where you are, but I'm just telling you, I'm just saying that God ordained the lineage of Boaz to be intersected with your life. And it would manifest his kindness. No matter what your background, no matter where you came from, no matter the misery that you're going through right at this point in time. That's why I have a hard time. And maybe it's my personality, but sometimes I feel guilty, a little ashamed. That you've all got, not all, some of you, not all of you. Some of you are much better looking than others. I'm not talking about appearance-wise. I'm just talking about your stories. A good portion of you. Now, some of you have remained hidden and we don't know who you are. And for years you've remained hidden and we still don't know who you are. You want your pain to be what people see. Or you want your success to be what people see. But you've remained hidden, and it's okay to ignore somebody's success. I'm good at that. It just doesn't matter to me. But it's another thing to not receive somebody's pain as justification for them to live in bitterness. Because it feels like I'm not being nice. I need to enter into their bitterness and validate their bitterness, right? And I just can't do it. I don't know how to do it. It would be a nice. And I'm not holding myself up as saying, I'm just telling you I can't do it. And because I can't do it, it doesn't mean that I know the right words to say otherwise. You know what I do because I can't enter into the validation of the bitterness? I usually just hide. I go, okay, I don't know what to say to these people. I am not going to agree with their storyline. I'm not talking about not entering into the pain and being there. That's not a problem. It's when the storyline becomes a prophecy of how they think the end's going to turn out. And I don't know what to do with that. I don't want to get killed. Because when you got somebody that has believed a prophecy of despair and destruction and you don't agree with it, you might get hurt. So I end up pulling back. I'm not looking for right or wrong or looking for anybody to fix me or anything like that. I'm just saying that we are confronted with the same story in our relationships today. And if the church is going to be the church that God has created us to be, then we're going to have to live in this tension all the time of being faced. Do I agree with the prophecy that somebody has in their life, or do I move according to the Spirit and just see what happens? But there's a hope that the Redeemer has been put into our lineage. That's where we enter into the story. Now, Naomi, back in verse 1, had a kinsman of her husband, a man of very great wealth, a mighty warrior, of the family of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. Verse 2. And Ruth the Moabitess said to Naomi, please let me go to the field and glean among the ears of the grain, after one of whose sight I may find favor. And she said to her, go, my daughter. So she departed and went and gleaned in the field after the reapers. And she happened to come to the portion of the field belonging to Boaz. Happened to come. We find ourselves. Around here, but you'll hear us say over and over again, we find ourselves. It's not as if any of our intentions have made things work out in any way whatsoever, but we're oftentimes finding ourselves in the pathway of our Redeemer. And we don't know how we got there from here. But we thought our lives were organized to go this way, and they didn't. Now we thought we're cursed, and they're organized to go this way, and it turns out that that way is where our Redeemer is waiting on us. You see, God had prepared a way for the poor to be cared for. The harvest was to be harvested in a way to leave behind a portion of the crop for the poor, for the widows, for the fatherless. And they would then glean from the portion that was left there. For the corners of the field, they would come and they would glean. And it was put into the law so that the people would remember that they are in this land by the grace of God. That they don't own this land, that they have it by the grace of God. And leaving this for the poor, the widow, the penniless would be what would take care of them. In fact, they were to be deliberately not frugal. They were to hold everything with an open hand. They were to be generous, to consciously let some of the harvest stay behind. Now I want to talk about tax time for just a minute. I couldn't miss this opportunity to take a right-hand turn because we took our taxes to the CPA this past week. And, you know, it's a time period where some of us end up somewhat frustrated. And we scream and we holler, and I'm just saying there's an indication that you're thinking. Now, I'm not talking about politics. I'm not talking about the government. I'm not talking about inefficiency. I'm right there with you, right? I got all this kind of stuff. And I'm also not talking about that they need more and they should have more. And I'm not talking about that either. I'm just saying that your reaction inside when you think the government has more of your money could be an indicator that you've grabbed hold of something that really doesn't belong to you. That when you get so angry and so mad, you're not doing it because you think the government wastes your money. I mean, God's money. You're doing it because you think the government wastes your money. You have taken this and you've got it tight. And I've got it tight. And we look at that tax period and we sign the end of it. Your blood pressure might go down a little bit if you just did this. Because it's not yours to begin with. Now, most churches use that to get more money out of you.
Well, you can't because the government's got it.
I'm just saying, let go of a grip. You know, shake your hand out a little bit. It's what Israel had to do every time they looked at the corners of their fields. They were going, but look at the corners. And the law would tell them, you can't touch that. But because it was a law, I guarantee you that the owner of the field was coming back out there, and he in his perception had taken ownership of the field, and he had ownership of the corners, and he resented the fact that those poor, good-for-nothing people that ought to have a job were out there gleaning from the corners. I just know because that's me if I live according to the law. But we're going to interact with somebody here that wasn't living according to the law, but was living according to his heart. As chance would have it, Ruth finds herself in the field of Boaz. And Boaz shows up for Ruth's good, for Naomi's good, for our good, and for God's glory. Verse 4, Now behold, Boaz came from Bethlehem and said to the reapers, May the Lord be with you. And they said to him, May the Lord bless you. And Boaz said to his servant who was in charge of the reapers, Whose young woman is this? The servant in charge of the reapers replied, She is the young Moabite woman who returned with Naomi from the land of Moab. And she said, Please let me glean and gather after the reapers among the sheaves. Thus she came and has remained from the morning until now. She has been sitting in the house for a little while. I mean, if you can just see the story start to unfold. Here's Boaz, a man of the stature that we have described. He walks out, the reapers and the gleaners are going, and he looks and his eyes immediately go to Ruth. Now, I don't know how many messages that I ran across that said, well, he found the good-looking woman out there, and that's who he's looking at. I believe his eyes were drawn to the prostitute woman. I think his eyes were focused on the one that didn't fit in, the one that was dressed differently, the one whose skin color might have been different, the one who just didn't look like she was supposed to be there. And then the testimony that came from his field manager said, here's the one that has been here from the morning. Already the stories were being told about the faithfulness that Ruth has. And we start to have the beginning of a love story. Have you ever, you look at soap operas? Liars? You might not be home in the day, but my mom had her stories. She had her stories that she would watch and she would look at them, and I thought, this is the stupidest thing I have ever seen. It is, I mean, I can forecast what, not that I was watching them, but I could forecast what was going to go on. And now Tracy has her story that she only one that she watches. Let's see. She watches The Young and the Restless. No. She watched The Young and the Restless. And I would never watch The Young and the Restless. Because a man could never be as controlling as Victor is. And Jack Abbott, I would have punched him out by now. And Phyllis, never. And Phyllis just might end up with Victor before it's all over with. Again, that's right. Nobody could believe this kind of stuff. But there's something inside of us that wants to see a good love story the same way that there's something inside of us that loves to see kindness. Listen to the words of Boaz the Redeemer. Boaz said to Ruth, listen carefully. So he sees her and he talks to her and he says, listen carefully, my daughter. Do not go to glean in another field. Furthermore, do not go on from this one, but stay here with my maids. Let your eyes be on the field which they reap. Go after them. Indeed, I have commanded the servants not to touch you. When you are thirsty, go to the water jugs and drink from what the servants draw. He's telling her that you don't have to feel like an outcast. He's telling her that she's safe. He's telling her that you can let your guard down. Why? Because the Redeemer, the Lord of the harvest, has let it be known. And we see the first thing as he goes to Ruth. We see this aspect of a redeemer is that he seeks out the destitute. He seeks them out. He goes for them specifically. And he goes past all the other workers till he gets to Ruth. Then in verse 10, she fell on her face, bowing to the ground, and said to him, "Why have I found favor in your sight that you should take notice of me, since I am a foreigner?" Boaz replied to her, "All that you have done for your mother-in-law after the death of your husband has been fully reported to me, and how you left your father and your mother in the land of your birth and came to a people that you did not previously know. May the Lord reward your work, your wages be full from the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to seek refuge." He goes to the destitute, and then he saves the destitute from harm. And he recognized that where this came from, the Lord of the harvest has sought her out, and now he's protecting her. And now she is elevated to a place of acceptability. I hesitate to tell this story. I don't know why. Just stupid, I guess. But my dad grew up as poor, in the Depression as poor. And he, by way of a whole deal, we end up all in Meriwether County, which is south, east of LaGrange, kind of in that area, close to Noonan, down in that area, but there's nothing much down there. It's rural. And the county is 95% black in its population, 5% white. And the 5% of the white people have owned the prime land and have taken most of the currency is pulpwood. And they would find the owners and they would get the pulpwood off of the black people's land, and they would pay them nothing for it, and they would make all kinds of money. And it was definitely a culture of segregation. And the segregation was received from the entire culture, and it was weird. So 5% of the population of the county controlled the money of the other 95%. And you could still walk into a sharecropper's house where you could see daylight through the boards on the. And I would watch my dad as I remember we had a guy up the road, Coleman. Coleman had a mule. And Coleman was good friends with my dad. And Dad would send me up the road to get the mule. And we would plow with the mule. And so he would send me up to borrow Coleman's mule. And Coleman would walk out. Coleman was a big black man. He would walk out and he said, "Boy, this mule is a lot bigger than you are. But you don't have to be afraid of it." And he would give me the halter, and I would walk the mule about a mile back up the road into the yard, and I was afraid every step of the way until I got back in the yard. And Coleman would come down sometime, and he would just help Dad, and Dad would go to his house, and he would help him. But I will never forget the day that they had a bucket with water in it, and they would share water. They had this metal ladle. They would just dip from it, and they would share that wasn't done in Meriwether County. And I could watch my dad seethe at the disrespect that came. And you just take that culture and put it into this field. And you hear Boaz's encouragement for Ruth to go drink from the same water source. And you start to understand what he is saying. He's saying for a Moabitess, the one who was the lineage of the ones who lured Israel into sexual immorality. He's saying, because the Redeemer is in your family, you have been raised to a place. And you don't have to be afraid. Now, we're going to get to the crux of the matter, but all of you have been raised to a place where you're not the servant of any man. And I'm not talking about racial stuff here. I'm not talking about social injustice or any of the catchwords that are out there. I'm talking about the fact that when you walk out this door and you immediately go down because some man's opinion of you somewhere down the road has made you ashamed of something, I'm telling you that because the Redeemer lives, you have been raised up. And you can live free of fear. Because he comes to the destitute, to the people that need mercy. Look at Colossians 1:13 and 14. We got that back there somewhere? There it is. For he rescued us from the domain of darkness and transferred us into the kingdom of his beloved Son, in whom we have redemption and the forgiveness of sins. You have been redeemed. He seeks the destitute as his family. He saves the destitute from harm. And then he invites us to his table. Verse 14, at mealtime Boaz said to her, "Come here, that you may eat of the bread and dip your piece of bread in the vinegar." So she sat beside the reapers, and he served her. Boaz served her the roasted grains. And she ate and had some left. And then as we move on through verse 17, so she gleaned in the field until evening. Then she beat out what she had gleaned, which was about an ephah of barley. She took it up, went to the city, and her mother-in-law saw what she did. And she took it out, gave it to Naomi, what she had left after she was satisfied. And her mother-in-law then said to her, because she had been keeping quiet, "Where did you glean today, and where did you work? May he who took notice of you be blessed." You see, the average gleaning was 1 or 2 pounds, with 50. You see, God is not only a God of mercy, he's a God of grace. His blessings of what comes with our redemption is that he doesn't just save us out of being at a destitute place and bring us to the place of a field hand. He sits there and he gives us every blessing there is in heavenly places, and he pours it into you. That's who you are as a redeemed people. There's so much going on. I'm going to pull it up short now, and we'll get back into it next week. I know we've gone a little bit long. But do you see? We've got 4 women. We've got Rahab, the prostitute. We've got Bathsheba, the adulteress. We've got, who else am I missing in here? Who? Tamar, the one who seduced her father-in-law, Judah, to have a kid. So she seduces Judah. I mean, these are all stories of the women having to do what they had to do because they were in the line of blessing. Tamar, Hagar, Bathsheba, and now we see Ruth. Isn't it amazing? That's who God chose to put in the lineage of Jesus. Check it out in Matthew. Other than Mary, that's only 4 women that are mentioned. It's because that redemption is in the line of mercy. If there's no mercy, or if you've got just a little bit of our mercy, then you have gone to the throne of a different God. Let's pray. Father, we come to you because you came to us. You met us where we were, in whatever way we were thinking, whatever concept we had of ourselves, you met us there and you changed us. So Lord, I pray that you would bring us to a place to where we live as the redeemed, not as the foreigners that are afraid. I pray that in Christ's name. Amen. Thanks, guys.
Your love is